Hi, everybody. This is Caroline Smith, and I'm going to be talking about fashion history, particularly networking the 19th century. So, jumping right, we're going to go to what kind of questions I was asking going into my research. So, some questions that I had were what were people wearing? Where were they getting their clothes? How were their clothes made? Where were the materials coming from? And who was involved in the fashion industry? Jumping into those last 2 points is where we're going to start. But before getting into the fashionable world of the 19th century, we first need to take a look at where fashion starts. And fashion starts with raw material. When looking at the American South, the product that will be of most importance to Southern planters and the economy of the United States more generally is going to be cotton. While cotton is the main focus of the United States, other areas of the world will produce finer materials from silk. Silk was considered a much more luxurious and expensive product. It was also much harder to work with. Cotton, on the other hand, was much more versatile, while it was easier to manipulate into fabrics and it was also easier to dye. Now we're going to jump over into the story map that I made, and this is just to show the network ability of the fashion and textile industries. And we're going to start with North Carolina and raw materials. But we look at the American South in a general sense, the areas of focus of this project are going to be the Carolinas and Mississippi. But it is important to note that other places, such as Louisiana and Florida, were also necessary places where cotton production took place. The importance of cotton came in the 19th century following the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin is a machine that is made it much easier to separate the material from the seed. Planters in the South began to realize the financial benefits of cotton and they wanted to expand its production. During this time, we also see the Louisiana Purchase, in which the United States bought up the Louisiana Territory and it became a part of the United States. That land was then utilized by cotton planters for expansion of cotton plantations. But in order for cotton plantations to thrive, they needed labor, and in this instance, that labor came from enslaved people in the United States. There was a direct connection in the minds of plantation owners where they consciously knew that cotton was a growing commodity in the world and that they could make a good profit off of cotton production. I'm going to jump back over to the slides now. Once the cotton was picked, it would have to then go through a process in order to make it usable. In order to do this, there were a couple of different tactics in order to create fine strands of cotton that would then later be able to be woven. One of the ways that this would be done is by utilizing comb-like tools called hackles, which you can see there on the screen now. Depending on how fine the strand needed to be, depended on the type of hackle that would be used. Once it had been turned into strands, it can then be put through a flax wheel, which then converts the strand into yarn. The 19th century saw the expansion of mass production and industrialization for the fashion industry and the textile industry. Machinery were being made to make mass production easier and faster than previous weaving techniques. Previously, the techniques would be much longer because the technology dictated the speed, and much of it had to be done more on an individual basis. And this was just the creation of the textile. It took a very long time to just create textile and fabric. This doesn't include the dyeing process yet. While going to someone for production of textiles was nothing new, this was the beginning instances of production on a larger scale where these companies would be formed to quicken the process. Jumping back over to our map, we're going to go right through Mississippi and we're going to jump up into Lowell, Massachusetts and talk about the Lowell Mill Girls. During the 19th century, the creation of Lowell, Massachusetts was a huge aspect of mass production culture in the United States. Lowell started as a textile production factory, and over time, the town and surrounding culture would be drawn in and created around it. Lowell is best known for its Lowell Mill Girls. These were young women, particularly unmarried women, who would come from the surrounding farm communities and they would live on the factory property and work for pay that they had not previously been allowed. Women during this time were not necessarily venturing out to the work field unless absolutely necessary, but this was an instance of exception for women. Jumping back over to our presentation now. Alongside the production of fabric from these raw materials, there was also new technologies from the process of dyeing the fabric. One of the perks of this time in the 19th century was the invention of the roller print for fabrics. Previously, the fabrics had to be individually dyed, and then you would have to weave the colors into a particular design. This was obviously labor intensive as well as time consuming. The print roller, as the name describes, is a design that is placed onto a roller and then pressed into the material of the fabric. And as you can see here in the given examples, these are different cotton textiles used in the roller print. And these are going to be more expensive than some of the ones that lower class people would get just due to the sheer amount of detail and design that went into them, as well as the color that went into them. Jumping back into here, we're going to go through the financial trade of cotton in New York, and we're going to go right into cotton textile production for British, and then we're going to jump into France. So here we can see that British design of the textile from the presentation slide, and here is the silk textile production in France. Here is a silk textile, and on it is clearly embroidery. It's not printed. This is going to go in and show the amount of money that went into silk production rather than in cotton production. There's clearly much more time and effort going into the embroidery on silk. In order for companies to succeed, they required a large amount of cotton, which primarily would come from the southern United States. So while these production companies for fabrics was one of the first stops for cotton, it was the first connection that fashion industry would have with enslaved labor. As previously mentioned, cotton plantation owners knew that cotton was a necessity in the world at this point in time, and these factories knew that the only outlet to get cotton from was almost primarily the United States. Thus, they were dipping into profit from slave labor. These companies were creating cheaper and faster fabrics, and they were making money off of them because people were not willing to pay the large amount of money that finer materials and finer woven goods would cost. So here is just brief examples that I'm not really going to get into on how the textiles become clothing. You can look these over. They're pretty bare necessities for all women during this period. But again, I won't get too much into it. And then I'm going to jump into my conclusion of the project. Fashion was inherently related to the system of slavery and the capitalistic gain of it. Southern plantation owners utilized the labor of enslaved people to produce materials such as cotton, which would later be utilized in factory settings where cotton would be used and mass produced for cheaper garments. So rather than sticking with the previous methods of people making their own clothes, which tended to be more time consuming and expensive, they would instead buy their mass produced materials. With the influx need for cotton after this expansion of consumption of cheaper cotton-based goods, more money in the field of fashion would go to those cotton plantation owners, could then afford to buy imported luxury goods and garments made of materials like silk. Thus, all outlets of the fashion industry were benefiting from enslaved labor during the early period of the 19th century. Thank you everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.